He turned and looked toward the balcony. I sat up to look as well, but Timothy prevented me by wrapping me in his arms. "No, don't look." There was an odd smell like burning feathers. It reminded me of the night when the stables burned down and the horses had perished. I tried to look again, but Timothy held me close. "Lisby," he said gently, "if you look, you won't forget." Then he stood up and helped me to my feet. With his arm still firmly around me, he guided me out of the bedroom and into his mother's dressing room. "He's dead?" I asked. Timothy sat me down on the footstool beside the little sofa. "He's dead." I looked over my shoulder. The dreadful smell had followed us. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He was feeling me over for broken bones, working systematically and calmly, as if a man hadn't been torched to death 20 feet from where we had been standing a moment ago. He stopped with his hands on my shoulders. "Are you all right?" "I think so," I said uncertainly. He went and fetched the water basin and a cloth and then returned to my side. Bunching up the cloth around his fingers, he dipped it in the water and began to wipe my face clean. I could tell he was being thorough from the look of concentration on his face. "The next time I say hand over the seal," he said softly but firmly, "you will hand over the seal. Understand?" Again, I turned to look into the bedroom. "Should we go and get it?" He took my chin in his hand and turned my face back in his direction. "If it survived the blast, it will be fine where it is." The soft sound of a waltz was wafting up from the floors below, and I remembered that we were not alone in this house. I caught his hand as he was rubbing my nose. "But shouldn't we get it now? The prince is waiting." "He can wait another 30 minutes. "I suppose so," I said, letting him go back to work, but then I remembered something else. Jumping to my feet, I said, "George, I forgot all about him. Oh, Timothy, I think he's dead." He took my hand and pulled me back down to my stool. "He's hurt, but he's not even close to being dead." "How do you know?" "When Trey told me that you'd gone for the seal, I went up after you. I got there just in time to find George on the floor, a bullet in his thigh. He was the one that told me what had happened and that Saltz was heading for the roof. Don't worry, Trey wasn't far behind me. He might be slow on his bad ankle, but you can be sure that he's fetched help for George by now." "Oh." I regarded my hands and saw that I was still unsteady. "Still, I think we should go and—" "You're not going anywhere. After we've cleaned up these cuts, you're going to Marissa's room and going to bed." I watched his face as he worked. He was wiping my arms now, removing the dirt and soot off the skin, but taking extra care around the several abrasions. When I could no longer resist, I reached out and touched his hair. "You're doing it again. You're telling me what to do." He paused a moment in his work. "From now on, we'll tell each other what to do, yes?" "That might be hard, living in different houses." "Say it, Lisby. Say you've already made up your mind to marry me." I straightened my weary back. "You're mighty confident about yourself, aren't you?" He went back to work, smiling. "With reason." "Ha! Name one." "Easy. You refused to agree not to marry me, even when Aunt Esme promised you she'd give you the money if you did." "How did you spoke with her?" "Not me. I have agents to do my footwork," he said with a sparkle in his eye. Then, taking pity on me, he relented and said, "Thomas, the night he was mistaken for me, he was at your Aunt Esme's house representing his bachelor brother." I folded my arms. "Aunt Esme doesn't count because you know full well that I never allow myself to be coerced. Is that all you have?" He touched the cloth to my ear and scrubbed. "No. There's the little fact that you followed me a quarter of a mile through an underground tunnel. You wouldn't have done that if you weren't halfway fond of me." "You left me no choice, and you know it," I said, pushing him away from me. He wrung out the cloth and draped it over the side of the basin. "True, true. But there's one more thing." "What is it?" A purely mischievous grin was in his eye now. "You told me yourself that you loved me." "I never." "Never? Are you saying that you didn't whisper the words 'I love you' into my ear while we were dancing?" My shoulders slumped. "But that was your bad ear. You couldn't have heard that." He took both of my hands in his and softly laughed. "You never could tell your right from your left." I looked at his ears, did a quick calculation, and realized that he was correct. I had whispered the secret into his right ear, not his left. I felt a flush spread from my neck. "And now," he said, "since I'm already down on my knees, will you marry me, Lisbette Blackwood?" My throat constricted painfully. "Even though I can't tell my right from my left?" "Especially because you can't tell your right from your left." "Then I'll marry you, Timothy Easton." He smiled so broadly the sides of his face nearly reached his ears. "Then as you're betrothed, you must let me kiss you any time I want." "Of course, but let me finish cleaning up a little before—" But he was already kissing me. A moment later, though it hardly seemed to matter, we were no longer alone. There was a rushing of feet all around us, and as we were joined by a squadron of soldiers. Timothy waved them in the direction of his mother's bedroom, but after that we managed to ignore them quite easily. "And now," he said several minutes later, "now my ducks are all in a row." I pretended not to understand him. "Ducks?" "You know, the ones you're always telling people about when it comes to me. Well, you were right. I do like my ducks in a row." He counted on his fingers. Henrik Seal, the lost money, Aunt Esme, who was purchasing a stretch of land for my father for a very good price, and John Bigby, all of them in place so that we can get married. John Bigby, what does he have to do with all of this? He can't very well marry Jane unless he has a decent job. I hired him onto my firm in Audleton so that he can afford to propose. You wouldn't want to live in Audleton half the year without Jane, would you? Well, I said in astonishment, and what about poor Anne? Are we leaving her to the mercy of my aunt and uncle? Not at all. She'll be starting school out west as soon as she's old enough. I cupped his cheek. You and your ducks. What am I going to do with you? Plan for more ducks, of course. What more ducks do we need? The little kind that look like you and me. Timothy and I were married in June. We reserved seats near the front of the church for all the Redcliffs who cared to come. The neighbors were surprised to see them so well dressed, but old Bob simply said that business had been good for his oldest son, and no one said any more. Lawrence was not at the wedding. Indeed, he had not been home since the night of the ball. He packed his bags and vowed in a very poorly written letter that we'd never see him again. Truthfully, I think Aunt Geraldine was the only one who missed him. Torrey was not to be pitied. For one reason or another, I think we can credit his mother. He was engaged before the month was ended to Eltruda Givingsley. Eltruda was a stout girl who was rich enough to keep Torrey out of debt and resilient enough to make sure he'd never have the chance to squander his fortune again. They settled down on the family estate and raised pigs. Jane eloped with John Bigby, and contrary to everyone's expectations, the two moved east, not west to Audleton, for John to finish his education. As grateful as he had been for Timothy's offer, he was determined to be a doctor. They weren't rich by any means, but Timothy sponsored his tuition, and they managed to live very happily in a small cottage by the sea where Jane grew roses and learned to cook. I was disappointed because I had looked forward to having her in Audleton during the months we lived out east, but in the end it worked curiously for everyone's good. Several years later, when John was well established, he was summoned to a hovel to help deliver a baby. The woman had been left destitute by her husband, a man who had died in jail while serving time for robbery. As a strange twist of events, the woman was proved to be none other than Lawrence's own wife. After her son was born, the mother and child were brought to Brindalock. We were rather cautious about the event, for all of us wondered what kind of woman would ever consider marrying Lawrence. We were pleasantly surprised, however, when she turned out to be a sweet, unassuming girl who was terribly eager to please her new in-laws. Aunt Geraldine, who had aged considerably in the last few years, took wonderfully well to her new daughter-in-law, especially when the girl revealed herself as being only too happy to listen to what kind of tooth powder the neighbors were using. And so it was that Brindalock was not doomed, after all, to fall into the hands of the Eastons, as many whispered that it would be when our oldest son was born. As for Anne, she eagerly left for college in Audleton as soon as she was 17. As a tall beauty with gold-red hair and amber eyes, she caught the eyes of many admirers. Of all the eyes that took notice, however, it was when a young King Henrik happened to catch Anne's eye that things got interesting. But that is another story all by itself.